It's summer 1944. Allied airmen, sailors, and soldiers prepare for the invasion of Europe. Their mission is to secure a beachhead, break out, and liberate occupied France. But this isn't June 6, 1944. It's August 15th, and the massive invasion fleet is not heading for Normandy, but for the warm beaches of southern France. By summer 1944, the Allies are advancing all over Europe. The Normandy offensive is progressing, and in Italy, the so-called soft underbelly of the Reich, Allied forces capture Rome on June 4th, forcing the Germans to retreat up the peninsula. But these successes don't always go smoothly. The fighting in Normandy had been fierce, and in Italy, Allied troops are moving slowly in the mountainous terrain, with the formidable Alps still looming ahead. Allied command needed alternatives. One promising avenue of attack is the Riviera of southern France. As early as 1943, Allied planners had drawn up plans for an invasion dubbed Operation Anvil, potentially as an alternative to Overlord in Normandy. Although the main landing does happen in northern France, the major ports of Toulon and Marseille remain tantalizing targets. But not all the Allies agree with the plans for a southern French landing. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill opposes the operation and feels the forces for Anvil would be better used pushing through the Ljubljana Gap towards Vienna. This would allow Allied troops to enter the Balkans and perhaps limit Soviet gains. Even Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, can see that the Prime Minister is already thinking about the post-war world. Winston never talks about Hitler these days. He's always harping on the dangers of communism. He dreams of the Red Army spreading like a cancer from one country to another. It has become an obsession, and he thinks of little else. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower is more focused on winning the current war. With his Normandy ports already at capacity, he needs new logistical routes and more forces in France. Also pushing for Anvil is French Committee of National Liberation leader Charles de Gaulle. He's eager to use French forces and demands a French general lead the overall operation. The US refuses, but promises that French forces will liberate Toulon and Marseille and eventually be formed into a separate army. For the time being, though, the French Army B is subordinated to the US 7th Army. French Commander General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny has plans to break free from the limited role planned for his troops. Whatever the cost, I had to escape from the trap and pull myself out from south of the Alps, and with the least delay, reach as far north as possible. In early August, the British Chiefs of Staff finally agreed to Anvil, now renamed Operation Dragoon. The name change is to preserve operational security, although Churchill jokes it's because he's been, quote, dragooned or forced into it. Commanders set about planning the invasion, even using pre-war tourist photos to get the details just right. 3 US divisions will lead the attack on August 15th, followed by French forces, many of which are African units. Their objective is to establish a beachhead, repel the anticipated German counterattack, and then take Toulon and Marseille. The Allies expect that overcoming German resistance and capturing both ports will take about 45 days. Southern France had been part of unoccupied Vichy France in 1940, but this changed in 1942 as German troops took control of the entire country. By 1944, German troops and defenses await the Allied landings. General Johannes Blaskowitz's German Army Group G is responsible for southern France. It has around 230,000 troops, although only 30,000 of these are in the invasion area. Still, the region is rugged and giving the defenders a significant advantage. Although Blaskowitz expects an invasion, he can't be sure exactly where or when it will come. He also has other problems. The whole of Army Group G has been stripped of its best units, especially the armor, for defense in Normandy. By August, 2/3 of Army Group G's armored reserve has been sent north, where much of it is lost in the failed Mortain offensive on August 7th. Instead, the 19th Army defending the coastline is a mixture of understrength, poorly equipped and motivated garrison units. Based in the major towns and cities, most German units don't have their own transportation. Many are unreliable Osttruppen, volunteers or conscripts from Eastern Europe, including Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Yugoslavs and Czechs. Although some are ethnic Germans, the multinational force has problems with cohesion and communication. Josef Kirchner, a Bavarian serving with the 164th Reserve Grenadier Battalion, recalls. In my company, except for a couple of older men, we were all young boys, 17 and 18 years old. A lot of men were from Upper Silesia, but in fact they were Poles who'd been drafted into the German army. They could speak German, but they stuck together and spoke Polish, and I couldn't understand anything they were saying. They'd probably been prisoners of war, and because they'd had a grandfather or grandmother who was German, they were conscripted into the German army, or they'd volunteered for the army instead of staying in prison camps. The only armored force available to the 19th Army is the 11th Panzer Division. Made up partly of Eastern Front veterans, it's well regarded but also exhausted and under strength. To compensate for their weakness, the German defenders work on static defenses, including massive minefields and beach obstacles. Even so, they're overstretched along a lengthy coastline, which means fortifications are incomplete, isolated, and have gaps between them. Major Georg Grossjohann of the 198th Division is worried. With our experience with the Maginot Line in 1940, we should have known better about the value of fortifications. Yet, the defensive conditions of the Mediterranean coast could never be realistically compared with those on the Atlantic. It was obvious that this line of defense would be overrun in the first attack. In 1942, serving in southern France had been a perk for German soldiers. The beautiful weather and coastline were perfect for worn-out units to rest and recover. However, by 1944, the region is a hive of resistance activity, and the Allies tie this emerging force into Operation Dragoon. The French resistance, which is a mixture of many different groups, has around 75,000 members in southern France, although only a third have weapons. Their numbers increased rapidly following the 1942 imposition of compulsory work service, a system of forced labor for the German war effort. By 1944, resistant groups virtually control the countryside of Provence. Their ambushes and assassinations forced German units to stay in fortified garrison towns and only travel with significant escorts. In July 1944, resistance leader Henri Zeller explains. The Germans are practically prisoners in their own garrisons, from which they emerge in force for supplies or on a reprisal expedition, and these convoys are attacked 1 out of every 2 times by an uncatchable enemy. After 2 months of this situation, the German soldier is bewildered, demoralized, fooled. We know him, we steal his mail. They awaited the arrival of Allied soldiers like a deliverance. The British Special Operations Executive and American Office of Strategic Services contact local resistance organizations and improve cooperation. 3-man teams, known as Jedburghs, help plan and coordinate resistance activities, while 15 to 30-man operational groups carry out combat missions. Soon, numerous networks known as circuits are established throughout the region. Both before and during Dragoon, they're expected to provide information, sever communications, and prevent the Germans from destroying important dock facilities at the ports. Resistance fighters are also to assist Allied airborne forces sent ahead of the main invasion on Dragoon's D-Day. In the early morning of August 15th, American and British paratroopers, including an all-Japanese-American battalion, planned to land and seize Le Muy, a key garrison town and crossroad on the approaches to the invasion beaches. They will be followed by heavier, glider-borne units, and together their goal is to slow or prevent a German counterattack against the landings. Despite the detailed planning, the drop in the early hours starts badly. Thick fog obscures the drop zone, and only 40% of Allied paratroopers even land near their targets. However, this has unintended benefits. The Germans mistakenly believe the drop is larger than it is, which limits their response. British and American paratroopers are able to link up with local resistance and carry out improvised attacks, spreading chaos. For example, Allied forces managed to surround and cut off German General Ferdinand Neuling's 62nd Corps headquarters at Draguignan. Seaborne and commando units also play a role before the main invasion. The US-Canadian 1st Special Service Force attacks German artillery positions on the Ile d'Hyères, and the French African Commando Group sets up a roadblock near Cap Nègre. Casualties are light for both airborne and seaborne invaders, although the Germans do capture the French Naval Assault Group commandos in a minefield at Deux Frères Point. New York Herald Tribune correspondent Homer Bigart witnesses the raid on Port Cros. Reverting to Indian-style warfare, 3 groups of volunteer raiders daubed their faces with paint and charcoal and paddled in rubber boats to the cliff-girt shores of Levant and Ile de Port-Cros. Long trained in mountain fighting, they scaled rocky bluffs in darkness and, wrestling with a dense tangle of undergrowth, emerged on a trail that brought them to the rear of strong enemy positions, dominating the only beach available to landing craft. The pre-invasion raids on August 14th and 15th are mostly successful, setting the scene for the main assault. By 8 a.m. on August 15th, the 3 invading Allied infantry divisions are in position off the coast. The landings take place at 3 separate locations between Fréjus and Cavalère-sur-Mer, at beaches codenamed Alpha, Delta, and Camel. The initial Allied concern is mines, since the Germans have strewn the area with naval and land mines, as well as booby-trapped obstacles. 140 Allied minesweepers clear the area, but they also use more novel methods. The US Navy releases radio-controlled Apex drone boats, watercraft packed with 3.6 metric tons of explosives. These are intended to crash into obstacles to clear the way, although their reliability leaves much to be desired. One rogue Apex almost destroys an Allied landing craft. Allied warships and aircraft support the attack with a massive bombardment just before the landings. An armada of 900 ships provides fire support, including the US battleship Texas. Bob Farris, a crewman on a tank landing ship, later recalls the opening salvo from the Texas. Our ship was directly between the beach and the battleship Texas. When the Texas let go with her big guns, you could feel the concussion on the bridge. Your dungaree pants would move as if they were in a very strong breeze. Smaller rocket landing craft and fighter bombers from escort aircraft carriers also blast the beaches and fortifications with thousands of rockets. At H-hour, landing craft approach Alpha and Delta beaches, supported by swimming Sherman duplex drive tanks. As Allied troops come ashore, German resistance is light to non-existent. The pre-invasion barrage had swept away unreinforced pillboxes and silenced German artillery. Louis Harlan, who lands at Delta Beach, observes the carnage. We spotted a few German dead on the beach and about 30 German prisoners, but only 4 American casualties. To our right was a machine gun nest. Dead Germans lay in pathetic attitudes all around the gun, like rag dolls carelessly thrown by a child. They'd probably been hit by naval gunfire before any Americans had set foot on the beach. Most of the US casualties on the beaches are from mines, not German defensive fire. But not all landing beaches enjoy the same success. In the Camel sector, Camel Red Beach provides a more significant obstacle. Located on the Gulf of Fréjus, potential landing beaches in this area are limited by the harbor and cliffs. The beaches available to the Allies are heavily fortified with German sea mines, tank traps, barbed wire, a deep anti-tank ditch, artillery, and machine guns. The Germans even fortify the town itself, including with 220mm guns. Camel Red is also one of the most important assault beaches, since 2 major roads meet in the town and a German air base is located nearby. When Allied minesweepers approach the beach, they're forced back by German artillery before they can complete their task. The pre-invasion bombardment also does little to suppress the defenders here, and as landing craft assemble to go in at 2 p.m., casualties are expected to be high. Just moments before the invasion is due to start, a new order comes down. US Admiral Spencer Lewis, overseeing the landings, orders the Camel Red group to instead disembark at Camel Green, which has already been cleared. Allied planners have considered this option before the invasion, but US 6th Corps Commander General Lucien Truscott disapproved. He claims the change of plan delays the capture of the Fréjus airfield, which poses a risk to the invasion fleet and prevents close air support. He later writes of his frustrations. "The decision was a grave error, which merited reprimand at least. and most certainly no congratulation. Except for the otherwise astounding success of the assault, it might have made even graver consequences. A single German Dornier Do-217, likely from the airfield, does score the only major Luftwaffe success of the day. It uses a radio-guided HS-293 glide bomb to sink landing ship Tank 282 at the cost of 40 Allied casualties. Lieutenant Lawrence Gilbert sees the event unfold. A bright red, flaring rocket-like object, seen about 100 feet directly under a twin-engine, twin-rudder plane. The object was apparently motionless. The object then began to move ahead of the plane and downward on the same course as the plane. At this point, it turned approximately 90 degrees to starboard and apparently headed for LST-282. Bright red flame and white smoke were seen coming from the tail of the object, which resembled a miniature plane. Historians will not share Truscott's complaints. The decision to change the landing beach likely saves many lives on that beach, and it's unlikely that the airfield would be captured any sooner had Camel Red been attacked. It takes engineers several days to clear the beach defenses, even after Camel Red is captured from the landward side. With the invasion troops ashore, advance groups link up with the paratroopers and block major routes to the beaches. They now expect a German counterattack, but German resistance remains light. Sensing an opportunity, the US divisions advance further to the Blue Line and capture Le Muy. Meanwhile, French forces come ashore around 5 days ahead of schedule. The Allied invasion causes chaos in the German forces. With communications cut, the German command only confirms the invasion at 10:30 on D-Day. They launch counterattacks on August 19th, but it's too late, and Allied troops quickly break them up. German officers draw new defensive lines on their maps, but often the enemy has already penetrated them. By D+4, Allied troops are north of the Durance River and pursuing withdrawing German units. The Germans' only hope is to hold out long enough for the 11th Panzer Division to cross the Rhône and support an orderly retreat. As the Germans withdraw up the Rhône Valley, US troops surround Toulon and Marseille. They are to protect the flanks of French forces, which now enthusiastically demand to attack the cities simultaneously. Hitler has ordered the garrisons to fight to the last, but they struggle with poor defenses and an increasingly hostile local population. On August 22nd, Marseille locals rise up against the German garrison and help French forces who arrive the next day to throw the Germans out. In both Toulon and Marseille, the Germans fall back to fortified positions. Allied commanders urge caution, but exuberant crowds urge the French troops on against a demoralized enemy. By April 23rd, large groups of German troops are surrendering. Meanwhile, to the north, the 19th German Army falls back to the town of Montélimar. The newly formed American Task Force Butler pursues it, but a lack of fuel limits the US advance. The Americans expect a German counterattack soon after D-Day, so they prioritize ammunition over fuel for the invasion plan. Nonetheless, US troops position themselves to cut off the German withdrawal from the so-called Montélimar Battle Square, a 250 square kilometer area consisting of both rugged hills and flat farmland. Task Force Butler consistently tries to cut the N7 highway and Drôme River crossings, but German counterattacks force them back into the hills and along the banks. Fierce fighting erupts around Hill 300, Montélimar, Sauzet, and Puy-Saint-Martin. US troops put up temporary roadblocks, but they aren't strong enough to hold them. Instead, they plaster the Drôme crossing with artillery. Fleeing Wehrmacht support units run a gauntlet of fire as they cross to the relative safety of the North Bank. Local German counterattacks do achieve some success, but they lack the intelligence and coordination to take advantage of the fragile US position. Meanwhile, the Germans in Marseille and Toulon fully surrender on August 28th, ignoring Hitler's last stand orders. The battles cost almost 5,000 French casualties and resulted in 28,000 German prisoners. Allied reinforcements now stream north. The next day, the 19th Army starts its final withdrawal. Rearguard actions keep the pursuing US troops back as German units force their way across the Drôme and to the north. Saint-Vallier's parish priest describes the German column moving through the village. On the night of 31st August, there's a terrible storm. But continuously one hears the roar of motors, horns sounding, cries of riders, and especially of men on foot, exhausted, soaked through, imploring the vehicles for a lift. The resistance opened fire on the columns, dead and wounded. Officers try to find the mayor. There's rain and thunder. The Germans screaming, "The mayor! Hostages! Hostages!" By the time he comes down, they demand 15 hostages tomorrow at 0800 hours and tell him to stop the resistance fire or they'll burn down the village. Despite the chaos, the retreat is a German success. The Americans destroy some rearguard German units, but significant groups, including 75% of the 11th Panzer Division, escape to the north. The Montélimar battle and the liberation of Marseille and Toulon largely marked the end of Operation Dragoon. The Dragoon forces continue to push north, capturing Lyon and joining up with Eisenhower's troops by September 19th. According to historian Samuel Morrison, Dragoon was an unprecedented success with light casualties. Dragoon was an example of an almost perfect amphibious operation from the point of view of training, timing, Army-Navy-Air Force cooperation, performance, and results. In particular, the invasion drew on and benefited from years of imperfect invasions like Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy. One important beneficiary of Dragoon was Charles de Gaulle. After French forces were mostly excluded from Overlord, they now decisively participated in the liberation of France. The French Dragoon forces were eventually formed into the First French Army, giving de Gaulle a significant boost to his legitimacy and political aspirations. But there were also lost opportunities. If French armored forces had been sent north instead of into the ports, a stronger blockade could have been established at Montélimar and the German forces decisively trapped. Although Allied improvisation resulted in a speedy breakout, it also resulted in miscommunication and indecisiveness, especially at Montélimar. That said, it's not quite clear if the Allies could have overcome their shortages in fuel to advance so far, so fast. Contemporaries and historians have also debated if Dragoon significantly contributed to the final Allied victory. Field Marshal Montgomery even suggested that if the Dragoon forces had been moved into Normandy, the Western Allies could have seized Berlin before the Red Army. This, however, is unlikely, as the northern French ports were already overburdened supplying existing forces. Meanwhile, Marseille alone would eventually import 26% of all supplies into Europe, allowing for 500,000 more troops to enter the fight. Ultimately, Dragoon also marked the demise of the German forces in France. Following the failure at Mortain and the Dragoon landings, the German High Command advised Hitler to withdraw forces for the defense of Germany. With the Red Army's Bagration offensive cutting through the Eastern Front and the almost complete liberation of France, the scene was now set for the final battles for the Reich itself. In early 1945, the Allies set their eyes on the Rhine in Western Germany, and the Red Army was gearing up for their Berlin operation. The Battle of the Rhineland would be the last set-piece battle in the West, and the Battle of Berlin the last one in the East. Millions of Allied soldiers stood at the ready to bring the Third Reich to its knees, and the last German reserves would have to defend it. If you're curious about these two battles, we produced 2 World War II documentary series that together run for more than 8 hours. In Rhineland 45, we cover the battle for the Lower Rhine from the Reichswald at the border until the Allied crossing of the Rhine that involved the biggest single-day paratrooper landing of the entire war. In 16 Days in Berlin, we document the entire 2-week Battle of Berlin day by day. Both documentary series were filmed on original locations, feature expert guests like Ian from Forgotten Weapons or David Willey from the Tank Museum, and they show the Second World War in an uncompromising way that wouldn't be possible to show on YouTube. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45? On Nebula, a streaming service we built together with other creators. On Nebula, we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertiser guidelines, and the viewers there support us directly simply by watching our videos, which, by the way, are ad-free and usually uploaded earlier than on YouTube. If you head over to nebula.tv/realtimehistory and sign up, you can save 40% on an annual subscription right now and watch 16 Days in Berlin or Rhineland 45 or our brand new Nebula original series, Red Atoms, about the Soviet nuclear program. And that's not all. Apart from a growing number of Nebula originals, your subscription now also includes classes, where you can learn all kinds of different skills from Nebula creators directly. That's nebula.tv/realtimehistory for 40% off on annual subscriptions and supporting us at Realtime History directly. As usual, you can find all the sources for this video in the video description below. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do this without you. For more World War II battles, check out our videos about the battles of the Bulge and Iwo Jima. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Realtime History, the only history channel that doesn't talk about Hitler with our doctor.